here tonight in this soon to be the end of July. I cannot believe that we're only a couple weeks away from school starting, everything getting back into the routine. But I'm thankful for you being here tonight, and I appreciate it so much. And for those of you that, and there's been several that have asked me, said, I know you've got that remote to advance slides and everything, but I know there's a button on there. When you was talking about the rapture this morning, you press that button and that light almost fell out. No, that's not true. But if it was going to happen, it was perfect timing. I mean, I couldn't, you know, I've had a bunch of folks that said, has that happened before? I said, oh, first time in 15 years that we've been in this building. But you know what? Perfect timing. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better moment in a sermon for that to happen, because it was up high. We're talking about the rapture. Everybody looked up, here he comes, you know. So, but I appreciate you being back tonight. And we're gonna wrap something up here tonight. We've been talking for the last several Sunday nights about this issue of how to be happy. And I've spent time on it because I know that there are so many Christians that struggle. In fact, all of us struggle from sometimes in finding real happiness in life. And we get caught up in the routine, we get caught up in the circularity of life, and and it just seems like all we ever do is we get up, we go to work, we come home, we eat, we go to bed, we get up, we go to work, we come home, and it just, and it's the question, well, where's the fun? And so many people I've talked to down through the years that just are having a time trying to find joy in life. Now, let me remind you one last time I'm going to run through some things we've talked about, and then we're going to talk about one last little section of Scripture, and then we're going to wrap up and go home, because I know we got a busy week ahead. But if you don't remember anything else about this series, I hope you'll remember this statement. Happiness is more about a who than a what. This is so incredibly true. If your happiness is tied to a what instead of a who, you're never going to be happy, not for any length of time. You may have temporary little burst of happiness when you get a new what, but the problem with that, as we'll see in a second, is the newness wears off that what, and then what do? Your happiness needs to be tied to a who. And not to just one who, but to a bunch of who's. I mean, obviously it's about having Jesus in your life. That's a very important who. But then it's about family, it's about friends, it's about those people in your life. It's about surrounding yourself with the right group of who's. As I said back when we started this series, I remember when I was a kid growing up, I look back at that now and I realize how much we didn't have, But we had, in our little neighborhood, we had a good group of who's. And we had, as I talked about, that little basketball goal and everything that my dad set up for us out there. And we'd be out there every afternoon, of just a gang of us from the neighborhood. And we had a great time. I mean, I look back at that and realize what a wonderful time it was in my life. And most of it because I had the right who's. If you're in elementary school, when that can be a scary thing. But if you got the right who's, it doesn't matter about the whats you have. When you go into high school, again, the fear is I got to have some who's around me. I don't want to be sitting at the lunch table by myself. I don't want to be isolated. I don't want to be that person that just, I want some who's around me. And that just continues on all through our life. Happiness is all about a who or two, and it's not about a what. Now, this is what I've said again over and over. If happiness was about a what instead of a who, we could all just go get whatever our what is and we'd be happy for the rest of our life. Now, the reality is that doesn't work, because there's always that thing we think, if I just had that, I'd be happy. But then we get it, and what happens after a few weeks? We're not happy anymore. The reason we're not happy is because somebody else gets a better what than we had. We get our what. Maybe it's a house, maybe it's a car, maybe it's a boyfriend, maybe it's a girlfriend, whatever. But eventually, somebody else has a nicer house, they're driving a fancier car, they've got a better looking guy or a better looking girl, or whatever it is we got, somebody else has got something better. And if your happiness is tied to that what, all that's going to do is make you jealous, and you're going to think, you know what? A search for a happy what always leads to a happy what else? What else is there out there? That's why there are people, and we've all known people like this in our life, and there may be some of us that struggle with this, about trying to always get the newest whatever, because our happiness is kind of tied to that. And if I don't have the newest gadget, the newest this, the newest that, if my whats aren't better than everybody else's whats, I'm kind of sad. And if you live that way, you're dooming yourself to this Little bouts of happiness, long periods of sadness. That's just the way it works when you do this. And then we made this statement, and boy, this is so true. If an aging whatever, fill in the whatever, but be careful. If an aging whatever decreases your happiness level, you're tied to a what, not a who. If the fact that your phone is not the newest phone anymore, if that makes you sad, you're tied to a what, not a who. If you look at your car and then you see somebody else drive by and that makes you sad, you're tied to a what, not a who. Again, happiness is about the who's in life, not the what's. And this is, again, other than that first thing I mentioned that about the who's, not the what's, this is so important. And we've talked about this every single week, that happy people, there's three things that are true about happy people. They're at peace with themselves. There are so many folks who are not happy with themselves. You're never going to be happy with anybody else unless you're happy with you. And there's a lot of people that are not comfortable in their own skin. And I'm not talking about, saying, well, I need to improve. I need to get in better shape. I need to, be a little more disciplined on the job. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about if you're just routinely unhappy with you. If you're at war with yourself, you're never going to be happy with others. The second thing we talked about so much is that happy people not only are at peace with themselves, they're at peace with others. In the same way that you can't be at war with yourself and happy with others, you can't be at war with others and happy with anybody. You just can't. If you've got all these grudge matches going on with people, it's like we've talked about, and I mentioned this so many times. If you're at Walmart and every other person you see, you're ducking them because you're mad at them and you don't want to have to talk to them, how are you going to enjoy Walmart? If you're going to the football game, but you're spending the entire football, I'm talking about a high school game, if you're sitting at the high school stadium, but the whole game, you're looking 3 rows down at somebody you're mad at and thinking, boy, I'd like to give them a piece of my mind. I think they just got a lot of nerve even being. You're thinking, how are you going to enjoy the football game when you're at war with somebody? And then the most obvious example at all. If you're in church and you look across the auditorium and you're saying, boy, it burns me up there. Of course, they ought to be here. If anybody needs church, they need it. The way they've done it, the way that. How are you going to enjoy church? You cannot be at war with other people and be happy. You cannot be at war with yourself and be happy. And most importantly, you can't be at war with God and be happy. You've got to be at peace with God. And that doesn't just mean salvation. That's what we talked about this morning, but it goes beyond that. There are people who know they've been saved, but go through seasons in life when they're disappointed or angry at God. And by the way, that happens to all of us at certain moments. But you can't stay there. You got to move past that. Because you cannot be happy in life and be at war with God, at war with others, or at war with yourself. And again, I said this, people want to know, well, where does that concept come from? It comes from right here. Very quickly. One of them, which was a lawyer, asked him, that is, asked Jesus a question, tempting him and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? In other words, what's number one? 600 plus commandments, which one is the most important? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. Now, Jesus is about to also add, he's going to say, this is the most important commandment of all. And what do we see right here? If we love God with all our heart, body, and soul, that means we're at peace with who? We're at peace with God. You cannot be at war with God. You cannot be unhappy with God. You cannot be angry with God. You cannot be disappointed with God and be happy. You're going to have to find a way past that. Because Jesus said, number one on the list is to love God with everything that's in you. This is the first and the greatest commandment. The second, Jesus goes on to say, I'll give you number 2. You didn't ask for it, but I'll give you number 2. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. In other words, Jesus said, after you love God with everything you've got, you need to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. By the way, we defined this in our class this morning because we were talking about that idea in the Sermon on the Mount that was in our lesson this morning about loving your neighbor. Jesus said, love your neighbor, not just, love your neighbor, love your enemies, love everybody. And then we looked at, in our class, we were looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan because Jesus defined who our neighbor is. A lot of people are like, oh, I love my neighbors. as long as I get to decide who's a neighbor. I mean, I look at my block, that guy's my neighbor, that guy's my neighbor, that lady's my neighbor, I love all that. But that guy down at the end of the street, we're not really counting him. He's more than 500 yards away and he's a jerk. He's not really my neighbor. Doesn't work that way. Jesus said, he was asked specifically, again, just like in this story, guy walked up and said, Lord, who is my neighbor? Define that. Jesus told the parable of the Samaritan. He talked about the guy that was leaving Jerusalem, was attacked, left beaten, bloodied, naked, lying on the street, close to death. And he says a priest comes, sees him from a distance, says, nope, not getting involved in that, keeps walking. A Levite, the priestly tribe, walks by, walks over to the guy, takes a good look at him, but nope, not getting caught up in that, he walks on. Then a Samaritan, who the Jews were always at odds with, and who, by the way, Jesus had a habit of making Samaritans the heroes in his story, walks over, binds up the guy's wound, loads him up on his own animal, takes him to a hotel, an inn, provides for him, leaves money for him to pay for any of his bills, and even tells the owner of the inn, if it goes past the money that I'm leaving here, go ahead and take care of him. I'll pay for it when I come back. Then Jesus looked at the crowd and said, now, out of those three, who was the neighbor? And you know what? The guy could not bring himself to say the words, the Samaritan is my neighbor. So you know what he said instead? Well, I guess the guy that helped him was most neighborly. Here's the point Jesus was making. Our neighbors are not the people that live closest to us. Our neighbors are not just family and friends. The whole world is our neighbor. And he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to love them, others, as much as you love yourself. And by the way, how much do we love ourselves? Well, most of us, who's number one on our list? And before you say, well, God is first on my list, or my spouse, I want you to remember you're in church. Don't be lying. Most of us, who's number one on our list? We are. I mean, let's just acknowledge that. We are. Self-preservation. We're all about us. Jesus said, I want you to love everybody else as much as you love yourself. Now, there's the three things we talked about. At peace with God, love God with all your heart, body, soul, mind. At peace with others, love your neighbor. At peace with yourself, love everybody else as much as you love your own self. So without those three things being true, you're just never going to be happy. It's just that important. Jesus said on those two commandments, which talks about loving God, loving others, and loving yourself, hang all the law and the prophets. He said everything hangs on that one thing. And then here's the last thing before we wrap this up with some new material. I said this, and this is so true. At the end of your life, you won't have possessional regrets. You'll have relational regrets. In other words, as I said the other week, you're not going to be laying on your deathbed and look up with some of the last words you'll ever say and tell your husband, honey, bring my shoes in. I just want to see them one last time before I go. Guys, you're not going to say, honey, wheel me out. Let me just lay hands on my sports car one last time before I cash. You're not going to do that. You know what you're going to do? You're going to want to bring in the people that you love. You're not going to, when you're dying, you're not interested in the whats. You're interested in the what? The whos. And if we could just figure that out before we're on our deathbed. How many times have I preached down through the years? I've done hundreds of funerals in these last 25 years, and I've said this so many times. In all the funerals I've ever done, I have never, said on a screen, showed a picture of somebody's house and said, listen, this guy that's dead right here, I want you to look at what he lived in. Is that not the greatest thing ever? I've never put up a picture of somebody's car and said, I've never put up a picture of somebody's bank account and said, wow, look at that. He had a good life. Never do that. What do we talk about when somebody dies? In every funeral I do, I'd use different scripture and different stories, but ultimately I talk about three things. I talk about their relationship with God, their relationship with their friends, and their relationship with their family. Isn't that what life is really all about? If you walked into a doctor's office tomorrow and the doctor said, you've got 3 months to live, let me tell you what you wouldn't care about. You wouldn't care about how much money you got in the bank. You wouldn't care about how many bedrooms are in your house. You wouldn't care about what kind of car you drive. You know what you'd care about? I want to make sure everything's right with God. I want to make sure everything's right with my family. I want to make sure everything's right with my friends. That's what life is all about. The who's, not the what's. But again, it's sad that it takes the approaching death for us to get our priorities in the right order. Until that moment when we realize I'm about to die, our priorities are about what's. But then when we find out, oh, I'm about to die, now I want to think about who's. What I'm saying is, let's start thinking about who's now and not focusing on the what's. Now, let me give you one last thing here tonight, and we're going to wrap this up. Now, we're going to go through this quick, but I want you to really hear this. You cannot, this goes back to that what's thing, you cannot acquire, exercise, or educate your way into happiness. Now, I want you to just think that through for a second. You can't have enough, look good enough, or know enough to be happy. You just won't do it. You can acquire everything this world has to offer and not be happy. As we've said over and over and over again, if you doubt that, look at the Hollywood crowd. They got more what's than anybody and got higher drug uses, higher alcoholism rates, and higher suicide rates than the general population by far. Because you can't acquire your way into happiness. Exercise. I'm talking about, trying to have that good outward appearance. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. That's not the point. The point is, you can have the physique of whoever and think, oh, if I just look like them, I'd be happy. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. Or you can't know enough. There's so many people that think, if I could, in fact, let me say it to you this way. This is a game we all like to play, the composite game. Now, you've played this game before. You may not want to admit it, but almost everybody I've ever known has played this game before. Here's how the composite game works. We see certain people, and we want to take little segments of their life and build one big life for us out of all these different segments. In other words, we say, if I could have his house, if I could have her car, if I could have their job, if I could look like that guy or that girl, if I could have his girlfriend or his boyfriend or his wife or her husband, and we want to be, for some people, if I had their nose, oh my gosh, if I just had their nose, I'd be so happy, And we put together this composite thing where we take these little things from all these different people. If I just had that, if I just had all these pieces put into one thing, then I'd be happy. Do you know the only composite person in literature? Anybody? Somebody who was literally put together by the parts of other people? Frankenstein's monster, right? I don't think he was real happy. But he was actually a composite person. A little bit of this one, a little bit of that one. This guy's brain, this guy's this, all put together. But that's what a lot of us spend our life doing. Oh, if I just had their house, if I just had their job, if I just had their this, if I just had their that, then if I could put all that together, I'd be so happy. Now, here's why that won't work. Because I've been a pastor long enough to realize that a lot of people that we look at and say, I wish I had their whatever, they're not happy either. They're not happy either. Because happiness is never about what's. Now, let me give you this to kind of wrap it up. I love this thought we're about to examine for just a few moments. You cannot educate your way, exercise your way, whatever, to happiness. But you can serve your way to happiness. Now, I want you to really let these next 5 or 10 minutes sink in, because this is the final piece of the puzzle, as it were. You want to be happy? Find a way to start serving others. And I'm not just telling you something that's found in the Bible, although it is. I'm telling you something that every bit of research that's ever been done on this issue has shown to be the case. There are people that have actually studied what are the most rewarding jobs there are. And I'm going to give you general categories, but you can figure it out. You know what this company did this great big bit of research on all these different kinds of jobs and how they correlated to the people that held those jobs, their happiness. You know what the top jobs were? in terms of happiness? People who are serving others, educating others, are protecting others. What's the common word in all of these jobs? Others. Others. The happiest people in the world are people who are working in a job where they help other people. You know why? Because you were designed by God not to meet your needs, but to serve others. Over and over and over in Scripture, Jesus illustrated that. How many times have we looked at John 13 where Jesus there the night before the crucifixion got down on his hands and knees dressed like a slave and washed the feet of the disciples? And he stood up after it was over and he said, now listen, I did this to teach you something. If I, the Son of God, can get down on my hands and knees and serve you, that's what I want you to do for others. Have a servant's heart. Now look, there's research to back this up. There's all kinds of studies. People could cite, I could cite to prove this. But here's the reality. I've seen this in my own life with my own eyes. Let me illustrate talking about our young people for a second. When my boys were younger, when Zachary especially was back in the youth group, you know one of the happiest things they ever did? That the group that went still talk about to this day is when they got on a plane, didn't go, and again, nothing wrong with these things. Nothing wrong with the youth group doing that. That's not the point. I'm not trying to argue that. But they didn't go to the beach. They didn't go to the mountains. They didn't go on some fancy trip. They went out to Seattle, Washington, to where one of our missionaries works with American native tribes. And they spent a week doing vacation Bible schools for all these kids that live on reservations that have nothing. And you know what? The group that went on that trip still talk about it to this day. What an amazing week it was. They didn't have their phones. They didn't have their Xboxes. They didn't have any of that. But you know what they were doing? They were serving others. Same thing happened just a few years ago when Stephen took a group down to Peru where Chris's mom and dad serve, and they spent a week ministering to others. And the people that went on that trip, many of them, I had people on a regular basis coming, that was, Daniel, that trip, that was, I would love to do something like that again. That was just, they haven't ever gotten over it. You know why? You were created by your God to have a heart to serve others. And you will never be happy. I will never be happy if my life is all about me and not about others. The man who founded the Salvation Army, General Booth, he once got up and he was supposed to address an assembly, a large national assembly of the Salvation Army. And instead of showing up, he sent a letter. And the guy that eventually stood up before the crowd, they were all thinking they were going to see him. And General Booth, the man who instituted the Salvation Army, he said, can't be here tonight, too much to do. He said, but I've got a message for you. And the guy held up the letter and he said, here's the words from General Booth. One word, others. That was the message, others. Life is about serving other people. But the danger, especially in the culture we live in, is we get so full of ourselves that there isn't any room to think about other people. Let me give you a very brief story from Scripture to drive this home. In 2 Kings 4, during the time of Elisha the prophet, you remember there was Elijah and then Elisha, his successor. It says, now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, this woman, her husband was one of the sons of the prophets, which simply means he was one of the guys that worked under Elisha, okay? She comes to Elisha and she says, thy servant, my husband, is dead. And thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord, and the creditors come to take unto him my two sons to be bondmen. She comes to Elisha and she says, look, you know my husband, you worked with him, he was a good man, but he died, and now we can't pay the bills, we have no money, we have debts, and they're about to take my children and sell them into slavery to try and offset the money that I owe. She's asking for help. And Elisha said unto her, what shall I do for thee? Tell me what thou hast in the house. And she said, now I want you to watch this. Elisha says, okay, what do you want me to do? And then he asks this great question, what do you have? He's asking, what do you have of value? He's kind of thinking, you know, when you read the verse, you're thinking, okay, he's wanting to know what she's got. We're going to have a yard sale, and we're going to sell whatever you got. We're going to raise some money so they don't sell your kids, and we're going to pay your bill off. Here's what her answer was. Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house. Now let that sink in. She said, we don't have anything. No doubt they've already sold everything trying to pay off these debts. She said, I've got one pot with some oil in it. That's all I got. Now think of that. The only thing in the house. She's got 2 kids and her. We got no groceries. We got no furniture. We got no valuables. All that's left. The only thing sitting on the floor of my house is one pot with some oil in it. That's all I got. Now if I'm Elisha, I'm thinking, you're in a world of hurt. We're going to have a yard sale. You don't have anything. But that's not where Elisha's going. Listen to what he tells her. Then he said, go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy, wait a minute, her what? Neighbors. In other words, I want you to go borrow. Who do you borrow from in life? Others. Go borrow thee vessels abroad of thy neighbors. But he said, here's what I want you to ask for. Empty vessels. Now, do you think this made any sense to her? Here's what I need you to do. I want you to go to your neighbors and I want you to ask for some help, okay? Should I ask for groceries? Should I ask for money? Should I ask for donation? No, don't ask for any of that. Get all the empty pots you can get. Empty pots? Yeah, you need as many empty pots as you can get together. That's what I want you to get. That makes no sense. And by the way, he ends by saying, borrow not a few. In other words, he says, don't just get a couple, get a bunch. Get as many empty pots as you can come up with. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all these vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. Now think about this for a second. Here's what Elisha's telling her. Go get as many empty pots as you can find. Then, you know you've got that one little pot in your house that's got a little bit of oil left in it. Take that, pour it in all those pots far as it'll go. Just fill them up far as it'll go. So she went from him, shut the door upon her and upon her sons who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. Now, how many of us would even have the guts to do this? Think about what he's asking her to do. Go get all the empty pots you can get. Notice no telling how many empty pots they brought. Then she picks up her one little pot that's got a little bit of oil in it, and she's like, no, wait a minute. Maybe I misunderstood. I'm supposed to pour the oil from this into all. Maybe he just wants me to put a little drop into each one because I don't have that much. Do you know what I think she's thinking? I can tell you exactly what she's thinking. She's thinking exactly the same thing the disciples thought when Jesus handed them a little piece of bread and a little bit of fish and turned them around to 25,000 people and said, go pass it out as far as it'll go. Now, could you imagine Jesus giving you a plate with a few crumbs of bread and a few crumbs of fish and say, okay, now there's about 25,000 people there. Just go hand it out as far as it goes. And you're thinking, well, it's not going to go very far. But then you remember what happened? After everybody had eaten till they were full, he said, go gather up the remains. The remains, Lord, we didn't have much. Just trust me. Go gather up the remains. And they brought back 12 buckets full of bread and fish. That's kind of what she's thinking. She's saying, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But she got the empty vessels, and then she begins to pour. And it came to pass when the vessels were what? Full. Just like the disciples, as they started down row one and they're reaching in their little Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket full of bread and fish, and they're handing, well, maybe I got one more handful. Well, maybe I still got one more handful. Well, maybe there's still one more handful. And then all of a sudden you realize, it's kind of a God thing. My bucket's not running out. Then, here's the thing about being in the crowd that day. If you're one of the first 5, 10 people, you're not getting that much. Because they're thinking, I'm about to run. But when it finally hit them, this is a miracle in progress. The bucket's not running. Everybody else, they got a lot more. Have you ever thought about that? I'm like, if I'm on the front row, I'm like, can you circle back around here one more time? Because you've been a little stingy there at the beginning till you figured this out. Well, this woman starts pouring the oil, and one vessel fills up, and another vessel fills up, and she keeps looking at her original pot, the one that she owns, and she's thinking, surely it's in, but there's still just enough left. I'll pour some more, still a little bit left. Pour. And at some point, you know what she realized? This is kind of a God thing going on. It's not going to run out. Then she got excited. And then she said unto her son, bring me another vessel. And he said unto her, there is not a vessel more. And the oil stayed. You know what she was wishing then? Wish I'd got more empty vessels. Because you know what happens, right? Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil, pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest. Now think about how Elisha solved that problem. He said, get as many empty vessels as you can, fill them all up with that one little bit of oil. God's going to do a miracle here. She fills them all up. Then she sells the oil, makes a bunch of money from all these empty vessels that are now full of oil, and has enough money to pay her debts and live the rest of her life on. That's a pretty good deal. But think about what Elisha said. When she first came to him, he said, okay, here's what you got to do. You don't have enough emptiness in your life. I want you to go get every empty vessel you can get. Do you know what God wants to say to some of us in our day? You don't have enough emptiness. You're too full of yourself and what you want, and your desires, and all the stuff you want to gather up and get your arms around. God is saying what you really need to do is pour your life out into serving others. Because that's where real happiness comes. Again, what I'm about to say is nothing I haven't said down through the years. If you're here tonight and you say, but preacher, in spite of everything you're saying, I'm just so unhappy. Every day I sit at home and I just think about all my problems. I'm going to tell you what to do. I'm going to make it even more clear. Get out of your house. Go to a nursing home. You say, which one? It doesn't matter. Every nursing home you go into, they have one thing in common. Hardly nobody's in the rooms. Everybody's sitting out in the hall. Why is everybody sitting out in the hall? Because they long for what? Somebody to talk to. And if you'll just go up and down the halls of a nursing home and speaking, you say, well, I don't know if they'll talk back. Trust me, they'll talk back. And they will enjoy every minute. And you just sit there and for a little while, get your mind off your problems and pour your life into somebody else. And if that doesn't do it, get in your car and go to Birmingham. Go to Children's Hospital. You don't even have to go to a room. Just sit in the lobby and watch the families and watch the kids, the little babies, the infants, the toddlers, the early teens. Just watch them come through there and sit. Just ask a family, how you guys doing? And listen to their stories. You know what you'll do? You'll walk out of there going, God, I want to thank you because you've been so good to me. God, I think sometimes my life, but when I look at what other people are going through, when I see the loneliness of these people in the nursing homes, when I see these families that their little kids are going through these incredible physicals, God, all of a sudden, you know what I realize? You've been mighty good to me. See, the problem is not that we're not full enough. The problem is we're not empty enough. We need to pour out into other people's lives. I'll close with this. It's one of my favorite moments in the life of one of my favorite people. When Jesus showed up as an adult at the age of 30 or so at the Jordan River, where John the Baptist, was preaching and baptizing and doing all John was doing, you'll remember John looked at him. He knew Jesus. They were cousins. And he said, "There's the Lamb of God. Everybody needs to go follow him." Now understand something. Up until that moment, who was the star of the show? John was. Who was getting all the recognition? John was. Who did everybody want to talk to? John. Who did everybody want to follow? John. And then Jesus showed up and eclipsed him. A little while after that, when almost all of John's disciples and followers had gone away, now they're following Jesus, which is what he wanted them to do. One of the guys that stayed with him said, "John, aren't you sad? Aren't you unhappy? I mean, aren't you a little miserable that everything has kind of went away?" And John makes one of the great statements ever recorded. He said, "Fellas, let me tell you a simple truth. He must increase. I must what? Decrease. There needs to be more Jesus, less me. You want to be happy? Let there be more others, less you. Don't live a life where we're self-centered, all about what we can do, what we can gather, what we can, wrap up in our own life. Live a life of serving others. That's where true happiness is always found. And by the way, who exemplified that more than anybody else who ever lived? Jesus did. He literally poured out his life for others. That's our example. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the time that we've shared together. And God, I do pray that as we walk away from this series on happiness, that we'll remember some of these things we've talked about for the last few weeks. That it's not about the what's in our life, it's about the who's. That when we come